Please take a seat. We are about to begin. Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Pavis Devastinayutaya, Communication Officer from the IMF Communication Department. I would like to welcome everyone here in this room and our online audience to the press conference of the Intergovernmental Group of 24 on International Monetary Affairs and Development, or G24. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that we have simultaneous translation in English, French, and Spanish. It is my honor to introduce the distinguished panel at this table. The chair of the Minister of the G24 at the very center is Mr. Wale Adun, Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy of Nigeria. To his right, or to my left, is First Vice Chair, Mr. Akhtar Javed, Executive Director of the State Bank of Pakistan. And to the chair's left is Second Vice Chair, Mr. Bernardo Acosta. He's alternate Executive Director for Ecuador at the IMF. On today's panel, Mr. Acosta represents Ms. Sarija Moya, Minister of Economy and Finance of Ecuador. And of course, at the other end of the table is Director of G24 Secretariat, Ms. Ayabo Masha. Without further ado, may I invite Mr. Adun to give some remarks. Mr. Chair, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear members of the press, I cordially welcome all of you to this press conference. You received our comprehensive communique and press release summarizing today's discussions. I would now like to outline the principal points. Numerous political crises and conflicts globally have significantly affected populations and further strained the fragile global economy with particularly adverse consequences for developing nations. While acknowledging the temporary truce in the Middle East, we emphasize the necessity of diplomatic conflict resolution, international collaboration for de-escalation and cessation of violence, and initiatives for recovery and reconstruction in all the affected regions. Global economic conditions are deteriorating primarily due to disruptions in the supply chains, including energy markets, resulting from ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. All importing countries face increased current account pressures. Inflation may affect various sectors, undermining progress made recently, particularly on inflation. Rising interest rates and exchange rate vulnerability may escalate borrowing costs, intensifying debt vulnerabilities, and complicating economic management for EMDs, emerging market and developing economies. Concurrently, tighter financial conditions and heightened risk aversion in capital markets could reduce the flow of private capital. In this context, multilateral support and enhanced development assistance remain essential for vulnerable countries. We welcome the ongoing reviews and reforms at the IMF. Efforts towards quota realignment should be expedited, ensuring outcomes reflect members' relative weights without disadvantaging EMDs and low-income countries. Continued evaluation of IMF programs and policies, including the Financial Sector Assessment Program and Comprehensive Surveillance Review, is welcome. The IMF should focus on both macroeconomic and macro-critical issues affecting members, providing its advice in an even-handed manner. The IMF's central role in the global financial safety net is crucial for addressing multilateral challenges and supporting vulnerable countries. Recent reforms to better support EMDs are appreciated. Nonetheless, countries with limited access to affordable short-term and crisis-related liquidity continue to face vulnerabilities. Addressing liquidity imbalances and strengthening crisis prevention and response capabilities, including enhancing the existing safety nets, remain imperative. Surveillance should intensify regarding stability, focusing on spillover effects from systemically, I should say, important countries. The World Bank Group's emphasis on accelerated job creation, infrastructure, and innovative financing is fundamental to achieving its mission of a world free of poverty on a livable planet. Adequate financing remains vital, and the bank should fully leverage its balance sheet to boost its lending capacity. Collaboration with multilateral, regional, and national development banks and domestic non-banking institutions should prioritize mobilizing private sector investment, deepening domestic capital markets, de-risking private investment, and mitigating currency risks, as well as increasing access to credit for micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises. Resolving outstanding issues in the 2020 shareholding review is necessary to address misalignments, strengthen voice and representation, and enhance the World Bank's legitimacy. We emphasized the need for swift progress on other issues related to the international financial architecture. Regarding debt, we note advancements under the common framework, but urge reforms for broader participation and engagement with the credit rating agencies. On climate and development, we advocate for accelerated global climate action, encompassing adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, and biodiversity, supported by financial innovation and multilateral cooperation. Equitable energy transition and effective domestic resource mobilization, alongside multilateral tax reform cooperation, are essential to for sustainable development and addressing global challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before we begin the Q&A session, I kindly ask that all questions remain within the scope of G24's mandate and responsibilities. Country-specific or other questions outside of this purview should, of course, be raised in other forums, including during the regional press conferences taking place in the coming days. So please identify yourself, your organization, and specify to whom your question will address. Please. The lady in the front and second row.
Hi, good morning. I'm Catherine from Business World in the Philippines. So certain Asian central banks, such as the Philippines, are facing increasing risks of stagflation amid these energy shocks. So that leaves them in a dilemma of whether to keep holding fire or to start tightening to avoid the consequences of delayed action. So I wanted to know where the G24 stands in terms of how such central banks should strike a balance between these issues and ensure that the credibility of their monetary policy frameworks are not undermined under these conditions. Thank you.
Any other question on monetary policy or central banks? No, then I think this question probably should go to you, Mr. Javed.
Thank you very much. I think you rightly pointed out that this is a challenging time for the central bank and especially G24 members countries, which were already facing some pressure because of the tariffs and other related things. But this regional conflict has also put further pressures, and it's really difficult for the central banks to strike a balance. At the same time, I think the passing on the extra burden to the public, and maintaining the financial stability and the monetary stability. So central banks are very closely monitoring all these things, and those central bank or those jurisdiction who has already sufficient buffers because of their rule-based monetary managements, they are in a good position. But obviously there are some central bank or some countries which are more vulnerable. So the bottom line is that central bank have to behave prudently and strike a balance.
Thank you. Mr. Chair or Mr. Second Vice Chair, Ms. Marsha?
I would only add that central banks should take into consideration the source of the price hikes. What we're seeing is that it's mainly supply side constraints on oil production, and supply side constraints do not respond well to monetary policy like interest rate hike. So I will say that unless central banks see that some of these inflationary pressures are going into wages, showing up in real growth, they should at least on balance wait and see how things evolve. But of course, everything has to be in a data-dependent manner.
I think I would just like to add and re-echo the conversation regarding the central banks and monetary policy at this time. And I think the overriding message is that there's a critical balancing role here, where if interest rates are raised too early and too high in an effort to curtail or see off potentially rising inflation, that too can do damage to the transformations which are taking place in some economies. Whereas on the other hand, if in fact the interest rates are not moved in time, that too can do damage in terms of allowing too lax monetary policy or too lax expansion of the economy at the wrong time. So the central banks have a balancing act. They have a really important role to play in calibrating and helping to steer economies safely through this current energy crisis and geopolitical tensions.
Thank you. The next question, let me go to the left. Sir, in the blue suit.
Thank you, Rhoda Sidiri, Rise News. I actually want to piggyback off what Honorable Minister Wale Edun said, but that's on the fiscal side, how the G24 is looking at the balancing act. So as an example, forgive me for not forgetting country specific, but Ecuador and Nigeria, oil is very important to both nations. Both Ecuador and Nigeria removed fuel subsidies. Some countries are making a decision to go back to that because of the energy shock. So how do you address that balancing act? And then I guess how is the G24 looking at its communication with the IMF for assistance? Pakistan is pretty reliant on loans from the IMF. So those are my two questions, essentially, the assistance and the fiscal balancing act.
So, Mr. Chair, maybe on the fiscal policy.
Yes, thank you very much for that important question, Rutos. Clearly, the transmission is different for different countries at this particular time and the effects. So therefore, for the oil-producing countries, the Ecuadors, the Nigerias, you may say, there is the transmission of higher oil prices into higher revenues, all other things being equal for the governments at this time, which is totally different from all importing countries who clearly faced escalated costs. But I must say that it's also not a one-way street in the sense that even an oil-producing country does have transmission of the higher costs which feed through to from gas prices to fertilizer to food prices and so forth. So it is on both sides that this current energy crisis is affecting countries. And I think that the idea is to be able to have the resilience to to weather the current shocks. And that means, in some cases, if the buffers that have been built up have to be used. But I think that it is a question of using targeted and temporary relief, particularly for the poor and the most vulnerable, to help them through the cost of living spike, as opposed to rolling back the transformations which economies have taken. And as you know, in the case of Nigeria, that moved very rapidly under the President Tinubu, who came in 2023 to remove subsidies on petroleum products and to also remove subsidies that were related to the foreign exchange markets. And so those gains, which, if we look at it, were moving apace and have now been negatively affected by an external shock which had nothing to do with Nigeria or even the developing countries as a whole. Having made so much progress, it is important, I think, that we don't have a return to generalized subsidies and a sort of relapse into policies that have not proven successful in the past. So there clearly needs to be, at this time, whether an oil importing or oil exporting country, the focus really should be on helping the poorest and the most vulnerable to cope with the increased pricing regime that they will face.
Mr. Acosta, you would like to add something?
Thank you very much for the question. I think it is evident that this is a positive shock for net oil exporters. The shock would for sure boost the fiscal accounts and the external accounts, and it will create some space for responsible and perhaps much needed public investment in some countries. But of course, I think these countries facing these positive shocks must reaffirm their commitment to sustainable macroeconomic policies and making good use of this positive shock in a responsible manner. In Ecuador, for instance, the government is currently working on hedging the oil revenues in order to have more predictable and sustainable oil revenues into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to go back to your second question, but I've received a question online from Sufiq Fazan News First, MTV Sri Lanka, that's related to your second question. The question is, like Sri Lanka, there are other nations trying to grapple with the ongoing conflict in the Middle East and shield its people. What support is the G24 expecting from larger economies to assist smaller nations at this time? Let's start with Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Naturally, one would expect the weak, the strong to help the weak. You'd expect that the rich nations would step up at this particular time. But we have to remember that we're in an environment of reduced and diminishing support through overseas development assistance. And we have to remember that we're in a period where the developing countries, the emerging and developing economies, are facing a net outflow when you look at debt servicing and when you look at the diminished ODA and you look at even FDI. The debt servicing in 2024 of the developing countries at about $163 billion outweighed overseas development assistance of about $47 billion, plus even foreign direct investment. When you add those inflows, the outflow from debt servicing because of the elevated interest costs that developing countries pay outweighed what came in. So I think that whilst looking to see what can be done by the developed world, and even the multilateral development institutions should also step up to the plate at this time with support, liquidity support, as well as the usual thought leadership to help countries negotiate through. I think the most important lesson is that there has to be a reliance on domestic resource mobilization within these countries. The public sector, as in Nigeria, we brought in a comprehensive tax regime that not only improved resource mobilization, but at the same time reduced the cost of the tax cost to the lowest earners, and both individually and as governments. And it is this type of self-help, self-reliance, and domestic resource mobilization, including the private sector, that I think that countries need to look to both through this shock and going forward as the sustainable basis for transformation of economies that need to grow, invest, grow, and take their people out of poverty.
Any other panelists would like to add to Mr. Chair? Okay, let me move to the left of the room. The lady in the second row, your hand is up, yes.
Hi, Libby George with Reuters. Curious if you think that the IMF and the World Bank are doing enough now to support developing countries, or if they should be doing more. You know, post-COVID, there were some specific facilities that were rolled out. You know, you've mentioned that they need to step up with liquidity support. Is it enough already, or what would you like to see more of?
Thank you very much. I think, as I said, given the negative flow of financing to, particularly concessional financing to developing countries, no, we would like them to do more. We would definitely like them to provide, particularly at this time, additional liquidity, risk management tools that bring down the cost of financing. I would say in particular that the elevated borrowing costs and the debt servicing burden that developing countries are paying is weighing heavily on their ability to transform their economies and to achieve sustainable development.
Thank you. Ms. Marshall, would you like to add anything from G24 perspective?
Well, I think the point is that, yes, the multilateral organizations have come out with a wide range of policies on what they can do differently. The World Bank is supporting some of the development initiatives on energy, and the IMF is trying to review its programs and policies to make them more suitable to the needs of developing countries. But even with that, the gap remains. And so there is still much more they can do, especially on the debt side, on how they bring down the cost of borrowing. For example, I can say that on this table, we have 2 G24 member countries that are at the top end of the countries that pay the highest interest to the IMF, notwithstanding the reduction in surcharge policies, the surcharge rates. So that's one area in which the IMF can support developing countries, and there are also a wide range of discussions going on also with the World Bank in ways in which they can further support developing countries.
Thank you. We may have time for 1 or 2 questions. Let me move back to the center of the room. Kami, in the front. She's right here, sorry. Well, you can share the microphone. Maybe we have time for 2 questions.
Okay. Hi, thank you. Kemi Oshikoya with the Africa Bazaar. So my question is regarding emerging technology. And I was wondering whether you could talk about how you are ensuring that the emerging technology like blockchain and cryptocurrency will support developing economic and the financial stability.
Before I go back to you, any questions on transformative technology? No, okay.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Mayra Pacheco. I am journalist at Expresso in Ecuador, and I want to get more details about how the war affects to Ecuador. I know Ecuador exports oil, but at the same time, Ecuador depends on imports, fuels and diesel, and I need to know how does this affect its economy. Thank you.
Well, let's begin with on AI and technology first. Yeah.
Clearly, Kemi, as you've hit the nail on the head, that the era in which we are in is one that clearly is going to be dominated by AI. And I think the worry there is that it will create inequality before finally maybe helping to close the gap between rich and poor. So it's not a technology that one can say will lead to a leapfrog effect. However, in terms of technology generally, including AI, the focus of developing countries on domestic resource mobilization is heavily linked to technology, to automation and digitization. Because if you look at the issue of revenue mobilization, increasing tax to GDP, increasing government revenue as a portion of GDP, a large amount of that effort is going to be based on automation and digitization, including AI.
Anyone else on technology at this panel? Otherwise, Mr. Acosta, you would like to address Ecuador. Otherwise, I would like to remind you that we have the press briefing on Western Hemisphere later this week. I think it's on Friday. Maybe you can hear more Ecuador. But Mr. Acosta?
Mayra, I really appreciate your question. I'll be happy to address it bilaterally, given that this is the G24 press briefing, and we're dealing with multilateral issues here.
Yeah, we keep you posted on the press conference on Friday. I think I have time for one last question. You. Right here on my right-hand side. Yes.
Hi, thank you. Sabrina Escobar with Barron's. I want to talk about trade quickly. I'm wondering what role the G24 group is trying to do to kind of offset the massive changes into global trade regime in the past couple of years, and if trade between the different members is a way to offset that or to kind of increase that independence from the rich nations that perhaps are looking more inward as opposed to helping development initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you. That's the last question on trade.
Given that normally it is when world trade is growing that developing countries in particular have a chance to participate and feed into that growth. And what we have seen in recent years is a retreat from a world trading system that is rules-based and orderly. And instead, we have fragmentation, bilateralism, and breakdown of supply chains. And that has driven, of course, developing countries to now focus on domestic production, to focus more on regional integration as opposed to global, having global, I would say, intents. And that is, I think, what the focus will continue to be for in the meantime, ramping up domestic production, and for instance in Africa, looking at the West Africa market for Nigeria and countries in the West African sub-region, as well as the 1.3 billion strong African continent as a major focus of trade integration, as opposed to the global system, which for now has pretty much is in retreat, I would say. Thank you.
Ms. Marshall, you have the last word from G24.
Yes, I will say, if you look at the last paragraph of our communique, we did speak at length on our position on trade issues, our concern about protectionist policies and unilateral sanctions, and we did call on the multilateral institutions to revert to the framework whereby WTO is at the center of global trade policy. We still hold that position. We think that trade has been instrumental to development of many countries and also to lifting so many people out of poverty. But it will not work if there is no rules-based system, as the minister indicated. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we are at time. The G24 communique should have been posted on imf.org, and the transcript of this press conference will be made available. And with that, thank you for your time. Have a good rest of spring meetings.